And so just to get Jeremy B, as in Bentham?
No, I would never do that. No, my computer has a virus, so I borrowed a friend's laptop, and his name is Jeremy.
Okay.
We thought we were gonna have to kick you there for a second.
No, I would never. If I'm going to pick a philosopher, and I use that term loosely applied to Bentham, I would use somebody else.
So let's see. Some people are using the Stambaugh translation. Some people are using I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Macquarie and Robinson. Is that right? Macquarie. Yeah, some people like Chase are rich and have both. Uh, so I don't know. I figure it was probably a positive thing to have both translations. The more traditional one in the sense it's been around forever, and then the newer one. So the reading guide has both. The reading schedule has both. So uh, we can use both. So just to get things off, I will ask a question. And then if somebody else wants to talk about something else and ignore my question, that is fine. My question is, why does ontology need to study the being of beings? Why isn't it enough just to study beings in their various types and categories? Why do we need to study the being of beings? Anyone want to answer my question? If not, pick something else to talk about.
Uh, uh, okay. I don't know if he wants to study the being of beings. I get the sense that he's saying that studying the being of being just leads you to um, know not a whole lot about like what he considers Dasein. Like in my notes, like I have on uh page 5 of the Stanbaugh edition, where he says the being of being is itself not a being. The first philosophical step is understanding the problem of being consists in avoiding mesuntinta diisu. I can't remember what that is, and not telling a story. That is not determining beings as a being by tracing them back to their origin to another being, as if being sign had the character of a possible being, Scheistein. So it seems like he's saying that the truth he's not so much interested in like going back to what a being of a being is. He seems to be trying to find the overall structure or a process associated with design. Like I kept thinking when I was reading this, like because my ferrets kept crawling all over me and in my book, and I was thinking, if I find out what the being of a being is, like if I know the being of God, that doesn't tell me anything. God has no question of truth. Ferrets have no question of truth. Animals don't. We do. So that's not Dasein. I think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that we don't want to find, and it almost seems like he's kind of jabbing at the categorical imperative here. Like we don't want to find this ultimate transcendent sense of being. We want to look into our limited, finite being, and that is Dasein. Like that seemed to be what he was saying. Like I think he was laying the groundwork for how he's not trying to do that.
Well, what then is the question of the meaning of being? So he says, this is the top of page 4. The question of the meaning of being must be formulated. So I guess then I could ask, why do we need to understand the meaning of being? Why isn't it enough just to understand or just to categorize types of beings rather than the meaning of being?
Well, I think he thinks that it's been this kind of primordial question that, going back to like he would say even like the Platonic tradition, even Socrates in his own way have been like getting it wrong by too quickly um, uh, objectifying being into this kind of concrete sort of substance, and then just kind of putting it away and not thinking about it. But he thinks that it's something that should draw us into investigating it. I mean, I think he does have some kind of like, there's a liberatory, I mean, it does tie in with his like fascist project, even if we try to put that away, I think that's like, he's trying to get at like, let's go to it is a kind of fascist impulse, like let's go to the source of everything, but that's not to say that it can't be disambiguated or distinguished from the fascist project, but so yeah, I think he just has this like kind of reverence for the pre-Socratics and this kind of like primordial way of being in the world that we've lost in his view. We've like stumbled away from it and got lost into abstraction, and he wants to like get us back into this sort of this primordial mode of being, so that we can like figure out our new vistas, especially in like response to modernity, which he sees, he draws a lot from like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and all that we're like prisoners of the modern world, and we need to like get back to our roots and all this to kind of like have some possibility of freedom or something, I think.
Yeah, I was going to push back on some couple things that were said earlier. I think he is interested in fundamental ontology, the being with a capital B, that behind and in all beings, sciendas, das sciendas. Also, I don't know if he's so enamored with the pre-Socratics. I think there's some appreciation for the pre-Socratics, but he gives a lot to Plato and Aristotle for giving an authentic response to the question of the meaning of being. And he seems to say that kind of developed it in a way that since then the line's been dropped, and Aristotle kind of made the last advance on clarifying the question of the meaning of being. And then since then, we've just been playing within the paradigm set by Plato and Aristotle. But I think you were singing there, Matthew, when you were bringing in the modern condition. I think for him, he's indicating here early on, we're the kind of being, Dasign's the kind of being for which being is an issue for it. And this is even more acute in our modern condition. And he's a reader of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, who is trying to speak to our modern way of being in the world. But there's yet more to develop. Also, I wanted to say, like, of course we have the ghost of his Nazi allegiance, like, in the room. And to be honest, I'm skeptical whether we can really fully extricate it from his fundamental ontology. At the same time, I want to say it's a bit premature. I don't see anything yet. You know what I mean? To say, yeah, there's that irredeemable Nazi element right there. So it's there. We acknowledge it or not. But just to caution, looking for Nazi ghosts where there aren't yet any.
Yeah, I mean, I would think Heidegger would say it's impossible to read without filters, but I really hesitate to start off presupposing a certain project and that I'm going to find. If I start looking for something, I'm going to probably find it. But I guess I even want to, and maybe I'm just being naive here. But when I start reading this, I mean, granted, we can't, he's writing in the aftermath of Kant and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and all that. But at least the way he starts this project, maybe I'm naive, and maybe I'm just too willing. Maybe I'm willing to give him too much. But I see him just trying to literally come up with, what the hell does this thing being? What does that mean? Like, literally, what does it mean? What does that word mean? And I mean, I want to take him. I want to take him at face value. Was it a guy said? I have a book over here called How to Read a Book. Mortimer Adler. read a book as if it's true the first time, because if you don't, you'll never learn anything about it. If you start off reading a book assuming you already know what it's going to say and you already know everything about it, you're never going to be able to hear what the guy says. So I would counsel reading with an open mind. And at least what I see in this first few pages is someone saying, what does this word mean? And saying, well, you know what? It's me asking this question, and I am asking this question. And so me asking this question is a way that I am being right here, right now. I'm the kind of being that asks this question. And so that means that my own mode of being is going to be inextricably, affect the search for the answer. And so, and I also have immediate access to this. That doesn't mean I understand it, but I have a sort of primordial access to this which I am, which is, I think, a phenomenological move, right? I mean, prior focus was like, I am this consciousness. And he's like, well, I am this being. And so anyway, I don't mean that to be any great insights there, but all I'm saying is when I read him on these first few pages, I read him as a guy who's authentically trying to understand what the hell being means from the position of a certain kind of being. And I want to give him, I mean, I realize he was a Nazi, and there's many people that say that devastatingly affects his ontology, but like Eric said, I don't see that here. And so I want to read him as openly as I can to begin with. Sorry for that little sermon. I'll shut
No,
up.
you're good. No, you're good. And that's it. I wanted to kind of potentially use that to push us forward on this. And that one thing that I know, lashings for doing this. I will get them tomorrow when I go to Muay Thai practice. Okay, so don't worry. This movie, so you're talking about Origins, page 26 for M&Q, I think 5 for the other translations. What we have come down to is I take it to be a rejection of starting the inquiry from the point of trying to just rejecting the idea of origin altogether. That is not a concern for the inquiry to go ahead. If we were to find the origin, it wouldn't solve the question of Dasein or being for us. And so he's like, not an interesting thing to try to solve. That reminds me of a boy with a last name of F by the name of Fichte. Sounds interesting. There's a thing there, another German. We'll throw that there. And I think that kind of might lay bare something. He wrote, he's writing this, everyone goes to the Nazi thing. I don't know. The whole origin of the Volk seems to be a pretty important thing for the politics of fascism.
We haven't gotten there yet, though, Tristan. We haven't gotten there yet. We're talking about the first few pages here, dude.
I know. I'm just saying. That's pretty important.
I'm
Sorry, I just want to point, for one thing, but I want you to say something else. I think that moving forward, I mean, explicitly, the on page 427, thus to work out the question of being adequately, was make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. It's talking about, I think that the origin part, it's aside to bring it forward. He's saying that it's how Daseins are out in the world. And I think that's different from what Plato was doing potentially. I think that's why is being important. Well, it's because it's being in action, and it's being in its mode of existence. It's active state. That's why you can't really go back to origins. It doesn't really matter for dissolving that kind of question. I could be wrong.
There are many people who have studied Nazism and fascism quite a bit, who, no matter the surface similarities between the two ideologies, say that they're fundamentally different. And so I'm just uncomfortable equating those two terms as being the same, representing the same ideology. Second, I agree with Eric and Nevitt in that I think it's very reductionist to be reading someone like Heidegger, who obviously is extraordinarily important in terms of 20th century philosophy, through a lens of what can I see in this text that can somehow lead me to how to explain Heidegger's relationship to Nazism and the Third Reich. I think he's simply too important to do that, even though I think this is a rather substantial book, and if we would like to reference that when we're more towards the end, I then I would feel more comfortable about it. But I don't think it's helpful to do that now. I think we should just be dealing with the text as the text, and try to understand his terminology and what he's trying to get at in and of itself.
Well, would he be considered like influential to process ontology? Because like the thing that that I find interesting is we're talking about this to kind of reiterate the aspect that I don't think he's looking for a structure. I do lean more towards like what Nevitt was saying earlier, is that he's not looking for an origin, so that doesn't really elaborate anything. But like on page 12, at the bottom of page 12, he says the ontological priority of Dasein was already seen early on, without Dasein itself being grasped in the genuine ontological structure or even becoming a problem with such a name. Aristotle says, "Isuke ta anta pos istin," the soul of the human being is in a certain way a being. The soul which constitutes the being of all human beings discovered in a way to be axios or nuisis. He says nuisis. Okay, all beings regards to their thatness and whatness. That is to say, always in such a being sign. Because it's interesting that he's saying that suke is, and he's bringing in ontos with a preposition, and he, she, it. So like to have suke be tied with ontos and through. So it's almost like he's translating this as the soul comes through myself. So I don't think he's actually saying that, at least to me, that he's interested in finding a transcendental category or something that is going to define us that we can fit into. I think he's saying that there is a radical finitude to our ontology that can only be expressed uniquely with what our environment and focus is. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
I think you're onto something there. I just want to bracket real quick, and just because I brought up the Nazi stuff, so I just want to like make clear that I really like Heidegger a lot, genuinely, and I think he's, especially being in time, is worth talking about. And I wasn't saying that as like we should talk about it because he was a Nazi. And to the extent that I brought in the Nazi thing, I do think there's an element of, I mean, it is impossible now to like not recognize that, he wasn't just a Nazi. He was like, appointed to, screwed over Husserl and all that. And I do think I think the kind of view of a subject he's setting up, or this sort of non-Cartesian experience of being in the world, which is in line with a lot of what you were just saying, Joseph. Is that right? But like this model of a subject is worth pursuing and talking about and all that. It just happened to also coincide with like I think his conception of a kind of a perfect. It leaves open room for like a subject that's bigger than just like an individual person, and it can be like the kind of the event of the Nazi movement. I think like that is sort of like they at least go hand in hand. His personal conception and the notion of the kind of ontology. ontology that's underlying kind of the Nazi movement, at least his interpretation of the Nazi movement. But that's not to say it's not worth talking about, or that I don't think he's like smuggling in Nazi stuff, and like you can totally read. We should read Being in Time without being affected by those prejudices and stuff. I know I'm kind of rambling, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I guess what
Sorry, I think Joseph's right to situate the focus on finitude. I think, again, Heidegger has a whole big, or I say a whole big, it's like a long essay or a short book, reading of Kant as the philosopher to situate, like an anthropocentric view and a view centered on finitude, as opposed to, the Spinozan subspecia trinitatis, right? Like, he gives Kant a lot of props here. He also, and just, he's deeply engaged with the German tradition that came before him. And I want to say, in his way, he gives respect to Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard while trying to refine their contributions, right? And you already in these first few pages, I see a whole lot of that, just as, like what Joseph was hitting here, situating it in a sense of finitude. I see that as kind of like following in Kant, the discussion. I mean, there's a little nod there to Hegel and the logic. I don't know how much he really appreciates what happened there in the science of logic. That's one of my operating questions, right? But there's a clear awareness that Descartes gives us the cogito, the I think therefore I am. But what is this I am business? What is that being that's in the I am? Right. But this comes a little bit later. Right. But as far as regards the question of being that we're concerned with, it is already deeply ingrained in the philosophical project, and it's never been really made explicit in the way that he wants it to be made explicit. Right. I have my, again, sorry, I'm not going to go down that path. But if you look at Descartes' cogito, if you look at Kant's dismissal of the ontological proof, if you look at where Hegel starts the science of logic, and arguably he finishes the phenomenology with the speculative unity of thinking and being, he begins the science of logic with the speculative unity of thinking and being, it's the same sense of being. And this speculative unity of thinking being is a problem. It's a question. How do we demonstrate that we can think beings? And this is Joseph, the passage you read, where he's saying Aristotle had a kind of early sense of this. He got a sense that our souls are our souls as Heidegger wants to say Dasein, but our souls as human rational beings, right, as must in some way be able to come into contact with the being of things. There must be some kind of commonality or commutability between the being of things and the kinds of beings we are in order to affect ultimately a unity of thinking and being. But in order to make sense of this, we have to make sense of what being is, and that's still part of the project we're unfolding.
And along with that sort of human-centered thing, I mean, I think that's a phenomenological move, as in, from Husserl, which I think they inherited from Kant. And by that I mean, you have Husserl asking questions like, what does it mean to be? Well, there's always a conscious being asking that question. And so the answer to the question, what does it mean for something to be, has to be asked from within human consciousness, because that's all we got. And I think, Heidegger's doing something similar, except instead of starting with consciousness, he's starting with this notion of being. This being is in a certain kind of way. And I think the reason I specifically say, phenomenological is because, there's a tendency, probably especially prior to Kant, to think that we can somehow, I think it was Nozick that came up with this phrase, get a perspective from nowhere, right? So we can somehow gain God's perspective and look down at the cosmos and understand being. Oh, well, being is substance, and there's these accidents. And in order to be able to make that kind of move, you have to have some sort of, you have to have a position outside the system. Outside, you have to, in effect, be able to step outside what it is to be a human being, to be able to examine the cosmos from the outside and give this comprehensive, uh, you know, atemporal kind of answer to the question of what is being. And I think, probably after Kant and German idealism, and then you get to phenomenology, and they're like, you can't do that. You can't step outside what it is to be human. So whatever answer you're going to come up with as to what is the meaning of being, it's going to be from, I'm not sure if the perspective is the right word, but from the perspective of Dasein, because that's all we got. I mean, I can't get outside of this being that I am. And so whatever answer I'm going to give to that question is going to be an answer that is given from Dasein, and it's going to involve my very own mode of being as this being. And that, I mean, it seems to me that, again, I'm not really interested at this point in how Nazism infects that fundamental question, because to me it seems like a legitimate question and a legitimate way to begin. I think, again, it's the sort of fundamental phenomenological stance that anything I experience and know is from this position. And, which I think Eric rightly points out, you can trace back, to Kant.
I mean, I think he kicks off the work. If I knew nothing about Heidegger per se, right? Even if you told me like, hey, look for weird stuff in this. I mean, the beginning, this first section that we read, and especially really the first two subsections of that, I think are just like a very standard almost laying of the land. Like you would see in pretty much any contemporary book or writing, where it's like, hey, we've got this idea of this thing called being, but I think it's got, and it's got these attributes. It's universal, indefinable, self-evident, etc. But I think there's a problem with that as far as how operable this concept is when we want to extend its applications outside of these more narrow constraints that it's been put into over the course of the history of philosophy. And what I want to do is demonstrate that that's an issue, and then kind of build off of that towards this more grand project of explaining what this being is that we were so interested in. And I mean, not to like railroad the conversation in a particular direction too much, but I found his characterization in that first section in particular quite interesting, in the sense that it came off to me almost like a little reductive isn't the word I want to use, but it's very like narrative focused, as far as like he's got this, he wants to sell the point of this book by building up this idea that like we haven't moved on from Aristotle. We're basically just stuck turning the same wheel that he did. Thomas Aquinas just did the same thing. Kant pretty much just did the same thing. Hegel pretty much just did the same thing. They just did little tweaks to it, but it all comes down to these same fundamental attributes that the scholastics were interested in. And that's a problem for us as modern philosophers, that we haven't moved on with this. And just, reading through some of the attributes that are accredited to being in this Aristotelian style conception that he thinks permeates through the history of philosophy, it's understandable from his position to say why, like, to bring to question whether we really know what this being thing is at all. Because when you start listing off things like, oh, it's this universal, indefinable, self-evident concept. Well, if you're asking a question about it in the first place, it seems to draw at least one of those factors into consideration, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think his project is set up in a really interesting way, where he's directly identified the issues that he wants to try to correct in the conception of being at his time.
But I think from what I was getting from this first section is his acknowledgement of the difficulty of talking about this issue, because how do you separate ourselves as human beings? Sorry, I'm using the word being in that, from the whole concept of being. I think he's dealing with a real to me he's saying there's something extraordinarily difficult, and that's in the very essence of what this um, uh, issue is, right? And I don't think he's making fun of any of the earlier attempts at it. I think why he was bringing up all these older philosophers was this is the question that must be asked, and it's really difficult to answer, but that doesn't mean we ought not to do everything we can to answer it. Recognizing the limitations that we have because we can't separate ourselves from the question. It's like what Nevis said, there is no God's eye view. The only way we are going to come to grips with this is to understand our whatever we are, our consciousness, whatever word you want to use to describe human beings, that's part of the entire package. But at the same time, he's very serious, saying this is the question that must be dealt with. And that's why I view this book being extraordinarily serious in its intent.
I'll just quickly say, like, I think that someone else was bringing up post-structuralism. I think that's like the cool part of what Heidegger's bringing to the table is this sort of meta step in a way of like looking at the entire tradition and calling out our role in it as philosophers, whatever, in a way that is not deflationary, but just trying to get at the roots of like this kind of encultured aspect of what it is to do philosophy, to and this kind of unspoken, implicit, enculturated context in which we're even doing it, which gives rise to all kinds of vital questions that kind of permeate out from him in all weird, interesting, varying ways. So I also agree he's extremely important and worth pursuing.
But I would, ask Eric and maybe Dylan, other Hegelian people more familiar with Hegelian. Hegel, it seems like that's kind of a Hegelian insight too, is that you can only ask these kinds of questions I can only ask these questions from my position, and I'm always a situated being, and part of my situation is I'm a historical being, and so there's just no other way to ask that question. And I think again he's sort of addressing this claim that you can somehow get outside of your situatedness and get to something that is objective in the kind of absolute sense. I think of it, as analogous to, sorry to kind of go Zen, but let's imagine the eye was trying to understand what it means to see. Well, the eye is the closest to seeing, right? Because the eye is that which sees. But then, how is the eye going to figure out how it sees? And what exactly the structure of the eye is and how it processes vision. Well, the eye is the thing trying to see itself or trying to understand itself. And I think that's the fundamental problem here is I can only ask what it means to see from its position as an eye. And so it is closest to seeing because it is the organ that sees. So it's closest to seeing. But it is farthest away from understanding what it means to see because it has an immediate experience of seeing, but it doesn't have an immediate experience of its own structure. And it's hard to infer what that structure is. I mean, maybe that's part of what the transcendental deduction was supposed to do for Kant, perhaps. But it seems like he's pointing to a very difficult problem.
He'll say something about that in chapter 25.
I guess I'm wanting to jump in around the thought that I think kind of relating it to the Kantian tradition or the Hegelian tradition, which is kind of an open question for me. I know in the preface it does reference, so relating to Kant as like the kind of transcendental project of like recognizing like what's the possibility for understanding being. But I'm not and I know like I read some things that gave me this impression, and just curious if anybody else things come to mind, but I'm not getting the sense that he wants to select Dasein as like our only thing, kind of like this from this sense of like limitation or lack, as if we have like a limited ability to access other things. I'm getting the sense that he wants to select Dasein as like a privileged being that has it is the thing that has the capacity to access the answer. Almost as this kind of like positive, optimistic note in selection of Dasein, as opposed to like, this is all we have to work with, so let's work with it. I see him more so saying that like Dasein being the being that kind of questions and has an issue with being, it has a privilege to understanding being. And like, that's why we should go for it. And it feels like, you know, like when he uses these words, like this kind of proper way of accessing it, it gives an impression off to me of like, he's optimistic about the success of his project by choosing Dasein and kind of going forth with Dasein. Whereas like, and I'm not too familiar with Hegel, but the general impression I've got, and I posted this podcast in our Discord, and these are kind of like Zizekian Hegelians, but they're kind of referencing like Hegel's thing is kind of coming around to the realization that like, we don't kind of like succeed. You know, there's this like kind of failure that comes, we just come back around to the failure or inauthenticity. Whereas I get the sense that Heidegger kind of has an optimism that by selecting Dasein and relating to it properly, that we can kind of like bring full transparency to the question of being.
And building on that, I mean, I think for Heidegger, the way we relate to understanding being and all this is not through some kind of cognitive thing, but it's like through our practices in the world and like an embodied uncovering ways of being that are kind of almost pre-theoretical or something, which might be at odds with a more Hegelian notion, but I don't know much about Hegel.
You know, for Kant and Hegel, we have speculative unity of all reason, right? For Kant, right? The first critique, speculative and theoretical reason, and the second critique is concerned with practical reason, being, you know, how we engage actively in the world. And then Kant later says that these are all species of one reason, but if you want to give priority to one, you give priority to the activity, you know, the practical being in the world. And the way I put it to people like this is like, you know, the theoretical reason, our scientific way of looking at the world is only meaningful because we're already actively engaged in the world. We study soil because we want to grow better crops. You know what I mean? So we come way down the road to an analysis of the chemical composition of soil because we were always already eating things that rely on crops being grown. You know, that's a very practical kind of activity. So it's steeped in the German tradition, you know, that you need to start with practical activity if you want to understand what we now have only recently, right, in our contemporary way of viewing the world, spun off as a separate realm of looking at the world, right? Purely objectively, scientifically. So the question of the meaning of being is always contextualized within our practical being. It's not to be isolated out, you know, it's something that you could theoretically study under a microscope.
I guess part of what I was suggesting, I didn't mean to. So I agree with Joey that Dasein gives us a privileged access to being, but he's also very clear. Like I was looking for the text, but I can't find exactly. But we are also furthest away from that, and I think it's again because we are that being, and so even though I am that being, I am in a sense am furthest away because I can't extricate myself from myself and then look back. I mean, so he says that kind of thing. We are furthest away. And also that there is because of the very structure of the way being, the very structure of being, it is hidden from us. And so, those are the kinds of things I was pointing to. It's like, yeah, we have this, in a sense, privileged access because we are the beings that are concerned about being, but it's furthest from us in a certain kind of sense. It's not disclosed to us in its complete clarity. It's kind of hidden from us, and it's not hidden by any malevolent being, or it's not hidden, like he says, it's not a lack of knowledge. It's not because we just haven't got the right knowledge yet. It's obscure because of the very nature of the kinds of beings we are. And so, yeah, we have this privileged access, but there's also this obscurity and difficulty in gaining some sort of transparent access to it. Because like he says, we don't have immediate, at least in the Stambaugh translation, he says we don't immediately grasp it. It's not like, again, that's why I say it's things like the Zen thing. Can the hand grasp itself? Can the eye see itself? That you just can't quite do that.
Right. I think he's looking for like a foot in the door, right? And he points to is as a clue for, well, here at the risk of stroking Christian's analytic flames, he points to the word is as a clue to figuring out what being is. Is this like a key to understanding being? Being can only be understood in observation of how is formulates the relationship between like S and P.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty important point that so the basis for the whole searching for an explicit meaning of being, it's all predicated on that we have a pre-ontological presupposition of being in our everyday average being. And that's gonna be what the existential analysis of Dasein that we get throughout this book is going to be about, is trying to make explicit this implicit idea of a presupposition of being that we already have. And I think so yeah, it's not like we have an immediate conceptual clarity that's operating with us. He's definitely gonna say that is not the case, but he does say that it very much is possible that we can take this implicit pre-theoretical idea, or maybe idea isn't even the best word, it's an understanding, I guess. The fact that when somebody says, X is Y, we understand what is means in some way. And from that's what he's going to build on in terms of kind of showing how we have this pre-ontological understanding of it, this presupposition, and then he's going to show the structures of it. And that's going to, and I think he is quite Kantian, I think. At least that helps me get something of a grasp of what he's trying to do with when he talks about the existential structures. I think they're pretty similar. At least it's productive to think about them as something kind of like transcendental conditions or forms or whatnot, in a loose sense at least, to try to get at these are the things that make it possible ultimately for us to have this presupposed understanding, this everyday average understanding of being. And yeah.
I'll just say in that sense, it seems like it's necessarily kind of hermeneutic. Like it's like we can't get at we have to dive into like the always already, like we're here now, and it's like we got to work with, I mean, that's a phenomenological move there. It's like we got to work with our situatedness in the world, and kind of we can't necessarily get to this God's eye view that someone like Descartes would want or something. Like it seems definitely, I think that's something we could all agree on. Maybe it's just like so antithetical to Descartes' whole project. It's like so radically not that view of the task of philosophy.
Yeah, I think if there's one major enemy of this book as a conceptual persona, it's definitely Descartes. And especially when he gets into the quite soon the being in the world aspect, how the being is always already immersed in the world, not as a, and you know, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's being kind of this enclosed subject with an epistemological relation to everything, trying to figure out what it knows about the existence of things outside of it. So he's going to reject that kind of like epistemological starting point and instead start from this phenomenological standpoint of being already immersed in the world among equipment, is what he'll call stuff. And yeah, so in the next reading, he'll get more into what he means by phenomenology, and amongst a bunch of other crazy shit. He'll get into that stuff that Matthew was talking about in terms of, yeah, that's what he's going to talk about with the always already, you know, what is available to us and what can we do with that? That's going to be the whole phenomenological aspect of what he's doing.
I mean, I definitely wanted to like reinforce this like kind of back and forth that we've been having slightly as far as like whether, oh, are these limitations or these opportunities? I really think it's like a glass. Are you a glass half full or half empty kind of person? Because I feel like you see a lot of people do this with Kant, where they look at like his schema for cognition and they go, oh my God, we're so limited. Oh, this is awful. We should be, you know, or you can look at it and you can say, like Kant does, and you can say, look at all of the opportunities to expand our understanding that we get from realizing that this is the framework. And I think you can do the exact same thing with the position that Heidegger is putting us in, where you can look at it and you can be like, oh, geez, there's nowhere to go here. We're just so limited. We need more. We need to be Descartes. We need Descartes. Or you can look at it, and it seems Heidegger is going to lead us. He says, look, there's a lot of important big things that we can draw out from this. It's, you know, this is not the end of the road. And yeah, I mean, so I think it is true in both directions, but which way you take it is kind of like a temperament thing more than anything.
I don't know. I find myself leaning against it. I'm still just kind of feeling like for Heidegger, like being isn't like the noumena. Like it's not, again, I guess it doesn't feel like this thing that's outside of like our world, but it feels like I'm not sure how to talk about it, but it feels like when he like at the end of a section we read today where he starts talking about time and this kind of like relationship of being to time, it feels like he is like trying to bring that into, I guess, the finite as almost as a way of saying like we have access to this. There's not like a restricted kind of like piece of being that like we just can't ever, I don't even want to say no, but he's using this word understand. I don't know if that'd be appropriate, but
I mean, again, you know, the stuff he says about it's farthest away, it's in some sense is fundamentally hidden. I mean, I agree. I don't think he's saying being is something like a noumena or something like that. I think it's just that our mode of access is our very mode of access makes it difficult for us to understand what it is we are accessing. So, you know, I don't think it's not like it's like the noumena, you know, which is that which you can know nothing about in any positive sense. I don't think it's that at all. I think he seems to want to say, no, we can understand something about the structure of being, but because of our nature, it's not immediately apparent to us. I mean, I think if it was immediately apparent, if what being really was, you know, so immediately apparent, Plato and Aristotle would have explicated it. they would have said, oh, look, I have this immediate access to exactly what being is, and this is what it is. And they did say that, but what they said was, according to Heidegger, was not quite on target there. And I think because they didn't understand that it's covered up in a certain kind of way. And so I don't at all mean that it's like inaccessible in some fundamental way. It's just that we don't have this kind of immediate understanding of it. We have like, it is us, but we can't bring it forward in a way that we can immediately grasp it.
I think what we may find as we go forward is that the problem with it is that it's most accessible when we're not conscious of it. And so we cannot, it does not lend itself to examination for reasons that he will explain further.
Yeah, I think somewhat hesitant to bring in later Heidegger. And some people say that later Heidegger makes no sense at all. I think I'd disagree, but so some of the things that Heidegger will say about being in time later is that it gives Dasein too much seeming agency over this access to being, when it's really, he's going to have this kind of pious attitude. I mean, even uses the word piety and whatnot in relation to it, about being receptive to being as the kind of active agent of disclosing itself. And then, but the big thing is going to be that this paradoxical kind of thing, but if you think about it, well, it's going to disclose itself by concealing itself in a certain way. So what does that mean? So when Plato comes up with Plato will see being in a certain way. That in a way is disclosing itself to Plato, but simultaneously it discloses itself in a form that also conceals itself. And if you can get that paradox and not just see it as a stupid contradiction, I think you can start to understand the subtlety of what is going on and why it's, in some aspect, it's definitely hidden, but still accessible in a kind of partial way. And that it's not so much to do with us as Dasein or humans or whatever, but instead it's what being itself is actually doing in making itself open and available to us. Yeah, it's definitely a little I think there's definitely some like partial aspects of a kind of mysticism of receptivity to being, but I don't know. I find it interesting. It's kind of like the best way to think about being is to think about something as a kind of like ultimate irreducible mystery, but that you can still kind of understand it, and it's just being receptive to something like the mystery of how being will unveil itself.
Well, and tied in with that, like in his on the work of art or whatever it is, he talks about like an ancient Greek ruin now, or something we'd go to and visit as like tourists, and it has a certain meaning and context in our culture that's no longer like a living work of art. But he would say, like in ancient Greece, it would be something that would ground the whole town around it. Like the entire town would find its meaning. Its Daseins would understand themselves and the meaning of their lives in relation to this temple or something. Whereas now, especially when you get into like the question concerning technology and all this, it's like now we live in this kind of situation where it's like that's just, that one, this thing that used to be when it was a living work of art grounding the meaning of people's lives, is now like a commodity that you can go witness, and like, you go pay $50 to go look at it and take a photo of it and put it on Instagram or whatever. And it has a different, it no longer speaks meaning to Daseins and stuff. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think his notion of being is something which makes intelligible the entities that are existing inside of it. Like, and so that touches on what Nevitt was talking about like the eye not seeing itself as the fish in water or something. It's like the fact that for Heidegger, our lives are made meaningful in relation to it in such a way that you can't even fully get a grasp of it until it's already not speaking meaning anymore. Like, going back to that analogy, or not even analogy, maybe for Heidegger would be like literal, looking at like an ancient temple in ancient Greece or whatever. When you're an ancient Greek citizen, it's just functioning. Like, it's just you just see it as, this thing that's speaking, that your life is meaningful in relation to. And the fact that it no longer does that is only intelligible once it's no longer a functioning work of art in that sense. And so that's where it's like no longer, that's getting to what Chase was saying about the seeming paradox of it disclosing meaning and simultaneously obfuscating meaning. It's sort of, I hope that makes sense. Kind of a little tipsy. I'll stop talking.
But okay, that confuses me, because I mean, obviously, an ancient Greek temple, when it wasn't ancient, is going to mean something to the people who live in that polis differently than it will be to anybody in the 20th or 21st century. Some of you may be pagan and give sacrifices to the ancient Greek gods. But that would still be, there'd be so much lived history in between the ancient Greeks and us that it would still be somewhat different. But I mean, how do I phrase it? I would think the people back then knew what they were doing, that they knew what the meaning of that temple was for them. And that it's not just us 2,000 or so years later that can say, oh yeah, we know what it really meant to you, because it doesn't mean that to us. I mean, so that means that the people who go to churches and synagogues and mosques today don't really know what the meaning of those buildings are, because they're fully involved in that faith, those faith traditions. And I think they know very well what their sense is of those places, and the meaning that any of those places give to them as members of the faith tradition. But if we're saying that something about being is, and I apologize for using the word subjective, but highly connected to us as carbon-based life forms, human beings, then the being, and I thought that's what Eric was getting at somewhat earlier, that talking about agriculture and land and things, that it's difficult to have a capital M meaning that is separate from human fill in the blank, human agency or human goals or human sensibilities or human conceptualizations.
I think it's really important to avoid the word subjective with respect to Heidegger. It's really to do with the fact that they're connected to a living world, right? So the fact that that at some cathedral in France, people 500 years ago may have had a different understanding of that temple than people today, like cathedral today, isn't what he's getting at. It's that monument in that monument in Greece is kind of dead. There's no community that's centered around it anymore. That it's part of the life of, but part of this is way outside of pagan time. I think the origin of the work of art is about how that interacts with being, which is a different project, I think. I mean, there's a close relationship, but I think if we start talking about that, we're significantly outside the text because we're somewhat several years down the road.
Well, I think what may still be applicable here, and maybe I've got this completely wrong, but is this notion of horizon, which is something he brings up here in this context. And so here's my possibly completely wrong interpretation of horizon. I think of the horizon as the background against which, or the context within which something shows up or appears as a certain kind of thing. And so, imagine what things are for a person of faith in, let's say, in a temple or in a church or something, what things are, what their being is for a person of faith, as opposed to an anthropologist, for example. And so, the way that things show up, the way that things appear. I mean, there might be things in that context that the anthropologist doesn't even notice. And, they may be apparent in some sense, but they don't have the kind of being that this same artifact or something would for a person of faith. This relic represents the being of some kind of saint that is still in some sense present here in this artifact. Whereas, for the anthropologist, it's a bone of a dead guy, And
I think you're dead on with that in section 17 or 15, sorry, it's section 15, that'll become clear that the anthropological examination of things is sort of contrary to it's contrasted to the experience of Dasein that we're talking about, the everyday being in the world.
And I think they literally, I think, not sure, but it is a different kind of being in the sense that things show up, things appear against a background or context of meaning and value in different ways, depending on what horizon you're occupying.
Yes, that's really similar to the reading of Heidegger that Graham Harman puts forward, and that he talks about Heidegger as one of the great thinkers of the background. And I think so another person he puts forward as a great thinker of the background that I think could help is Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist. So the medium is the message. So the idea is that the medium of your television or Twitter or whatever is more important in determining what's going on than the specific particular content that's being transmitted over it. But yet it's the medium that is really the thing that's making it possible. And I think he thinks the same thing about this is going to be our kind of preconceptual interpretation of being, how it reveals itself to us without actually us being explicitly theoretically aware of it. That's going to be this background that actually kind of like pushes forward things into the foreground. And we just kind of like passively accept the things in the foreground and think that's what's going on. So the anthropologist looking at bones of a temple or whatever is going to see those bones and whatnot, but because of the action of the background without the background itself being obvious in it, kind of like a Gestalt perception kind of thing. Which I think, it's kind of using analogies, I guess, but I think at least helpful in thinking about it as kind of like a background, foreground kind of thing going on.
I have a question, which is this what he means when he's making the distinction between, the ontological and the ontic, that the ontic is like, we've assumed the background already, and now we're just comparing with that paradigm in mind or whatever in ontologicals to get kind of using that metaphor to step into the background and question that. Is that what he means? Anyone? I'm still trying to work through the ontological distinction.
Yeah, I think
Thank you for asking that question. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think the ontic when he discusses the ontic, uh, he's discussing like particular entities, and I think that's kind of where his critique of science comes from. It's like, oh well, science kind of focuses on particular beings, and he's giving ontology a more like primordial status where ontology is going to get at the root of being, not just at the particular being of particular beings. He's trying to move away from that particularity, and you know, shoot for this bigger uh, bigger fish. He's trying to catch a bigger fish, you know.
I might like to jump in on that and not necessarily clarifying it further, but because I had maybe just more nuanced questions into that section. So that paragraph 4, section 4, the ontical priority of the question of being. And for me, I was in like, I heard Eric, you referenced something earlier around comparing this to Kant and seeing these like existential structures, and how they kind of might have some kind of like reflective pieces from Kant. But I was definitely kind of thrown for a loop when he was in that section, paragraph 4, when he starts kind of referencing existence, existential versus, or IELL versus IAL, and I'm curious about if that's translated similarly by the Stambau, but I was kind of totally thrown off by that and the relevance or the significance of that difference. And then like, you know, I was kind of thinking like, okay, whatever, I'll just kind of surf through it. But Eric's reference earlier made me think like maybe there's something that is going to make sense there. But I'd love if somebody does have a grasp, and I see Chase holding up revealing
you got this index card that tells me everything. But I got this copied from, I mean, I've added to it quite a bit really, but this is my ontological existential distinction card. And I would say if I can give advice to people, you know, reading this for the first time or not, do learn these distinctions. They seem very burdensome at first, definitely. I mean, they are, but he's going to use them quite a bit. And notice how he just starts using them and automatically assumes, oh, they've got it, and just keeps going with it. Yeah, welcome to Heidegger. But so I think Mario, yeah, that ontic refers to beings or entities, particular beings. That's the safest kind of simple summary of what is going on, where the ontological refers to those existential structures, these more general structures of Dasein. And so I'm looking at my card here, but the existential with the IELL at the end, so that's going to refer to a type of self-awareness or understanding that understands itself in terms of the ontic. So this would be Dasein understanding itself in terms of various particular entities and whatnot. In opposition to well, I say opposition, but the ontological and the ontic are very closely related for Heidegger. So yeah. The existential, that's also a type of self-understanding, but that refers to understanding in terms of these ontological structures of Dasein. And this is what Heidegger is aiming for with the with this whole book really is he wants to move in a way from existential self-understanding, this kind of presupposed pre-ontological understanding ourselves, understanding being through beings, which he thinks this is kind of like the transcendental illusion for Heidegger, is that being is constantly understood through particular beings. And then being is, obscured by that. And instead, that we can move towards this existential self-awareness, that would be this explicit conception, the concept of being in itself, I don't think he actually uses those terms in itself, but either way.
Just to further
Does he?
further refinement on that, Chase. I don't think he's trying to get away from an existential use or understanding of things, but but that to focus more on the existential, but to just kind of like support that claim. It was on page 16 in the Stambaugh edition. I found it curious, interesting. Existential interpretation can require existential analysis, provided philosophical knowledge is understood in its possibility and necessity. So I took that to mean that, generally and for the most part, in our average everydayness, we relate to the world in terms of existential. But when we read this book and imbibe it in the right way, then we look at the world through a new pair of eyes, and we can hold the existential and the ontologic existential together. And so just in summary, what came to my mind was, the Yorick skull, you can consider as a thing, an inert, in your hand. But what do we say when we hold Yorick skull? We say, do I have to?
Yeah, you do.
the word.
No,
You
I'm
know
not
the thing.
setting that
You
table
know
up.
the thing.
Well, if I can build
I
on
barely
that,
know you, Eric.
it seems like one way of making a distinction, then maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's almost like if you were at a therapist office and you say like, oh, well, I'm a salesman, that would be like an existential. You're kind of like, this is my identity, this like thing that we all have whatever preloaded conceptions about. And an existential would be like, well, like I'm a being before death. And it's like I had all these potential things I could be, and I kind of wanted to be a writer, but I settled into being maybe that's too Sartrean or something, but it's like, this kind of like awareness of this horizon of possible existential formations that you're implicitly aware of. Maybe that's on the right track. I don't know.
Yeah, to elucidate on both of those, I mean, on page 8, he says he's talking about like the sciences and mathematics, and he says these domains, for example, history, nature, space, life, human being, language, and so on, can in their turn be themized as objects of scientific investigation. Scientific research demarcates and first establishes these domains of knowledge in a rough and ready fashion. It's almost like he's taking the direction of Husserl and saying, I don't want to use phenomenology to create an exact science of experience, but I want to create or use it as a tool for investigation. Does that make sense?
Use what as a tool for investigation?
Like it's like he's trying to use the phenomenological method in a way to investigate being. And once you use that phenomenon, instead of creating an exact science of experience, he's taking this phenomenological method to investigate being, which in and of itself, as it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of Eric, it does tie you into everything in a way.
So I'm not totally sure about Husserl. Because I know he wanted to create, or at least I think from a few years ago when I read most of Ideas, but he wants to create a science of phenomena, but maybe not an exact science. And he actually talks about inexact essences and whatnot, which
a tool, not so much an exactness.
Yeah, so he'll talk about these essences and experience that are not exact. As an example, it would be something like roundness versus a circle. Circle is an exact geometric figure, but roundness has some inherent variation kind of within it in terms of how it would be ontically realized, say, to kind of mix in Husserl and Heidegger. But yeah, the Husserl influence is pretty subtle, and I'm definitely don't know a great deal about this particular aspect. I mean, it'd be interesting to definitely to know if people do, because it seems okay. So Heidegger clearly wanted to do something very different from Husserl, and he definitely thinks that Husserl is far too still attached to this Cartesian subjectivist kind of thing. And that's what he's really getting away at. He's trying to get away from that one Cartesian kind of starting point that people are into, that he thinks Husserl is also has fallen victim to, and instead trying to take phenomenology and aspects of it, and I think including that inexact essences kind of thing, in which indeed ontological structures will be understood through kind of their ontic variations. There's so like Eric was saying, and I think I should really correct myself, that so this isn't like a Platonic two worlds thing where, you know, it's annihilate ontic beings in order to, you know, fall into the bliss of non-ontic ontological being. It's like a mysticism in that crude sense, because he's very much trying to get, he's saying that the outlet, I think, to understand being, capital B, is through beings, but in a particular way in which you don't kind of reify being, capital B, through any one particular being. But it's all, yeah, I don't know. That's all. This is perhaps the trouble with Heidegger, and especially in translation, because of all the, you really gotta read Heidegger in German to understand anything, really. But
Can I ask you a question? Because I thought you were, Chase, going somewhere, and then it seemed like you're saying, "Oh yeah, well, it could seem that way," but no, that's not what I was saying. So I wanted to get a sense of your interpretation. What I thought you were saying is that Heidegger's argument was that if a person somehow could observe every single dog, right, every single dog that is in existence on Earth now, it wouldn't necessarily mean that that person knows the essence of dogs. That if you added up all the dogs all together, all of the dogs, that wouldn't necessarily give you the sense of doggedness.
yeah, so I think, well, I mean, this is it's a Platonic point, which I actually think Heidegger would somewhat agree with, in that you can't get a general definition of something or a universal from particular examples. So I think he would agree with that. But then I think also it's that, so Dasein does indeed have a privilege in that we are ontically, as particular beings, oriented towards ontology. And I think he thinks that's our privilege, and that's also our mode of access will be just that. And that's where he's gonna get at with existence also, as being something ontological, but yet has this kind of ontic dimension as well. And he talks about the ontic ontological priority as well, And I think, yeah, trying to get it this relation, which I can't remember exactly very well, but it's really important to how he's going to do the whole, especially the first part of the book, where I guess to give somewhat of a summary going. So when he first gives these structures of Dasein, he'll give them in the inauthentic mode, their fallenness, and then from there show kind of their authentic mode. And I think that kind of shows how there's this inner variation going on with the ontic, where it's kind of, they're not radically, you don't fly off to a different world when you understand something authentically. Instead, it's really the same thing, but seen from a different perspective, say, which is also going to be kind of his thing about grasping history and tradition and whatnot will be something similar, which is, I think, something to look out for in the future.
Quick and add on that, I think, at least my interpretation, it's like, I think it, like going with the dog analogy, like he would maybe say, the desire to even know the dog in its dogness is kind of taking us off the hunt, that we, if we're trying to get ontological, that we might ask instead, like, when I look at the dogs I've had, they always died, like, and they were temporal in nature. And what did that make me? How did I reflect on my own temporality from that? Like, kind of, that's like a more existential question and phenomenological, like going back to our kind of coping with the world and its temporality and stuff. Maybe that's me trying to make trying to relate dogs to it, but
I think I think dogs can be relevant, but I think at least initially the dog is, you see a dog, especially a dog with a collar or a well-groomed dog, that there is a Dasein kind of being to whom that dog relates, right? That is crucial, I think, in getting to this, is understanding that dog relates to Dasein kinds of being. It has come from some Dasein kind of being's home. It is going to some Dasein kind of being's home. It is being walked by a Dasein kind of being.
Yeah,
that sort of thing,
I like,
right?
Not the high. I just like that, because then it's like the dog is like, yeah, it's like its meaning as a dog is, at least for the all intents and purposes, from the perspective of a Dasein like we are, it's only intelligible in the context of how it's part of the patchwork of background practices of Daseins wherever.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, its very dogness comes from being domesticated, right? So its whole relationship is to Dasein in that sense, and I think that's he doesn't talk a lot, I think, about living animals, but at least not here.
Well, and to kind of add to that, I'm wondering if he's saying, like, particularly on the paragraph on section 11, is like, when you view human beings from previous ontological preconceptions, some things are lost in that aspect. Like, instead of dogs, it would be like, well, what is a circle? If you define it in its exactness, it is a point that we designate as the center that is equidistant from all other lines. Okay, that's the circle. Everything has to fit inside what that definition of a circle is. But when you phenomenologically experience something, when a kid gives you a picture and says this is a circle, you understand that is a circle when you see that picture, even though it doesn't fit the exact predefined mathematical definition of a circle. It's still a circle in practice and use in that environment. So I'm wondering if he's saying that there is a structure you can use when you use it as a tool, but we have to be careful not to use pre-existing phenomenological categories, because it kind of limits the human experience.
He'll specifically address the idea too of dealing with things that previous Dasein kinds of being have dealt with, have related to that are no longer here. And late in the book, he talks about, historical Dasein relationships, relating to Daseins of the past. That gets very, very complicated, I think.
Well, I mean, there's many directions we can go. There's a lot of points have been brought up that are interesting, but one thing just immediately came to me was Joseph's description of the circle, with the strict definition, and the idea of, okay, yeah, so that's kind of like a Platonic sort of universal or an idea where you could get, say, if you get a definition of it, it should be that every particular would then be subsumed under it as an example of it, as an instantiation of it. And that would be an example of this thing that he talks about as I think the second, so in the very beginning, when he talks about the bad presuppositions about being that have hurt this, have led to its hiddenness in a bad sense. He talks about it, that it's not a genus, just a universal genus that can be defined through specific difference. And this is also where it relates to Aristotle, who is going to say that, yeah, being is not just simply the biggest universal thing that then can be defined as a particular type that everything falls into. So the circle, the same way, it's not that we can just have a definition of being and then say, well, go through to each particular thing and say, does this fit with it? Does that? Think he'll definitely see that as too oriented towards those particular beings, and definitely way too just generally restrictive. And that for Dasein, it's not going to be so one of the kind of key words for Heidegger is the openness. That's going to be how we access Dasein, and how it's revealed is going to be through the open, the clearing, the light in the forest that shines through, and all. Yeah, just imagine yourself in the great black forest, and you're already there, almost.
Are we
Does that-
walking, Chase? Are you my partner on this journey
Absolutely,
in the forest?
yeah.
Yes. All right, Chase.
Does the notion of the open or the clearing, does that show up in this book, or is that a later thing?
Shows up here.
Yeah, that's in this book.
Does it
Yeah,
show up here? Okay.
Forests
which
are
is kind
critical
of
to
like the
Heidegger.
horizon idea, which I think he will still though use the word horizon. I think so. Maybe I'm wrong.
In the
Which
Stambach
another kind of-
translation, at least the horizon shows up in this first reading a couple of times.
Do you
Okay,
think
yeah.
it would be useful to reread Country Path Conversations at some point while reading this, or maybe do it sideways, like in tangent to it?
Oh wait, did you say do other readings?
I was just thinking, like in regards to Country Path, what did we read? Country Path Conversations by Heidegger. Like,
I think y'all did. I didn't join y'all for that, but I do remember you doing that.
yeah, this all sounds like really reminiscent to a lot of the things that were discussed on that. I don't know. Sorry, tangential.
I can't remember exactly what I read, but I read something in the last few days that in that book he was already beginning to move away from the project of being in time. So there's already some kind of shift starting there, but I don't remember any of the details. So
Since we mentioned the translations, those of you guys who are on the Stambach translation, I noticed, I mean, my old M&Q didn't have this issue because of the pagination had, there's a sentence, okay, this is, I don't know, did you guys have this issue? I thought this was kind of funny, but bad. Page 15, at the bottom of page, the sentence that starts.
Can you cite the German? You have to, the side numbers are the ones to cite.
Okay, the point I'm making is about the English translation, the Stambach. The MNQ is different. So this only relates to the Stambach. I have another translation where this doesn't.
Well, what was your point?
It's at the bottom of page 15, H15 as well. It seems at 16. So those of you guys who are reading the Stambach, I feel like if you're reading Heidegger, right, you're reading very, very carefully. And every instance of the word is something you have to imbue, right? No, seriously, like honestly, I'm not being pedantic here. This is like whoever did this translation or fixed the pagination for it. Like this is an issue, right? The bottom of 15, you start reading the sentence, and then every word has a certain weight to it until you turn the page, and then it completely changes the sentence, right? Look, it doesn't work as well when you read it out loud. Dasein tends to understand its own being in a sense of the being to which it is essentially continually and most closely related. That is hits differently after you turn the page. It's not even a point against Heidegger and the work of Heidegger. It's just like this particular edition. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you got to be careful where your sentences require a turning of the page.
I think you'll run into that same issue. Will happen a lot, though, not just with that, but also with like the word Dasein. Sometimes Heidegger hyphenates Dasein for a different meaning. And when he does that, and in a translation, it ends up being at the end of a line and splitting. You don't know, or if you don't know if it was hyphenated because it split the word or because Heidegger split it, unless you have the German to go to. It's really annoying.
I can imagine that being an issue too. You know what I mean? So issues to be aware of. But I just felt like, and again, probably Stambach and the people behind this, they did good work. You know what I mean? I just found it kind of funny and annoying to kind of run into a sentence that completely changes as you turn the page. You know what I mean? I say completely. I mean, maybe that's too dramatic, but it is a heavy shift. It's a heavy pivot that happens when you get the second half of that sentence, which, for the eyes and anyway, that's a small thing. That's a small thing. I'm not really quibbling with Heidegger here. But I also wanted to mention, now that Jason's in the room, like this emphasis on temporality, it's right up there with our boy Freddie J's analysis of high modernity, being very much concerned with temporality, So it kind of put in my mind, if you wanted to do a pomo being in time, it might be like, oblivion and infinite space, the obliviousness of empty, or I don't know, the incredible lightness of being. I don't know. Sorry, carry on.
Apparently, Joan Stombaugh worked with Heidegger while she was translating this. So I don't know if it exactly has his endorsement, but at least she consulted him in the process of translation. But I don't, I doubt if they talked about that kind of problem.
Yeah, I can't see that being Stambach's fault even. I don't think so.
Yeah, the editing. Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't really a rant at anybody in particular, except for, it's just the pagination and just we as readers, you know what I mean? Like, if you're trying to do this carefully, like, very carefully as you go and lend everything its proper, credence and weight, really follow his argument tightly. That's one of those ones where it just falls on the pagination wrong, badly,
Yeah, on that, actually, I think I'm a weird out here. I've been reading it alongside the Audible version of the text. I have a strict rule is that I do not listen to the Audible unless I have the text in front of me. and it even will just drop in. There'll be differences in text that aren't exactly in the sense of like turning the page. It's almost as if the person who is doing the audible recording had like a very different pagination as me. Like the emphasis on the page turn is different as well. Maybe if someone is brave and wants to read it alongside the audible with the other translation, it would determine whether or not they're using that translation over my translation. But you know, I'm listening plus I'm reading. I don't know. It helps me keep on track.
I have to say that the audible version of Being in Time sounds like a cruel joke from hell. That that sounds like just like utter impossibility. Like I don't. It's like an audible version of the phenomenology of spirit. It's like
But
I was
it's
gonna
like a double
say there was a
negation.
meme.
It's like a double negation. You know what I mean? You put the two together, and then it's a positive, and that's how it works. That's how it works. You're reading Heidegger on its own, negation. Audible, negation. Together, positive. You know,
so I
that's
do like to read fiction that way. I can listen to audio versions of fiction, and I like to have the text also with me, and it keeps me at a good pace, and it keeps my mind from wandering. But I don't. Maybe it's just me, but I cannot read dense philosophy with Audible at all. It does not work.
I have to reread too much. I think
Yeah.
probably like 80 times while reading through this one section, I was like, wait a minute. And I went back to the beginning of the sentence.
Also, I just should say I put it like on 0.7 speed. It's not like 1 speed. I put it on like 0.7 speed. I usually get ahead of the text a little bit, and then I just jump back anyways, and then come back forward with. It's chaotic. It's weird. There's lots of marks on my book, but yeah, I don't do it at 1 point speed. That's chaos. I tried doing that too much. 0.7 seems to be the sweet spot for me.
Okay, so with the 0.7, does that give you? Do the voices sound demonic at that point? Because I think that would be very fitting. That would be great.
The pauses do get a little weird. Like the pauses between like commas and whatnot gets a little weird. So yeah, it does get. I was like, at first it threw me off, but then I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And then I forgot about it. You know what I mean? It's like when the lashings get too intense, you forget that you're in front of a crowd. You know.
Well, if you play it backwards, you can hear Hitler saying shit if you play it backwards.
If you play it forwards, you can hear Hitler.
You must have learned that in a meeting somewhere.
But in addition to hearing Hitler, if you play it backwards, you hear the phrase "Paul is dead."
And Stairway to Heaven in the back a little bit too.
Hey, can I ask a question back to the text there? Nevitt, you mentioned that you said you're reading the Stambaugh.
Yeah.
And you said that you used the word horizon several times in the first reading.
Yep.
I'm trying to pinpoint where, because for some reason the Macquarie version does not have horizon in the Index of English Expressions.
I have the PDF I can access in just a.
Yeah, that would be helpful. It'll take me a minute to.
Horizon does come up in the M&Q. It does where? Don't remember, but it does because I was like.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to compare to see where it was used, because I know Nevitt was kind of focusing in on that, and I wanted to see if it was using it as well in both.
Oh, so are you looking for the German word for what
No,
horizon
I was
is?
not. No, I could switch to my German copy of the text though, and
Towards the bottom of page 17.
17
in the Stambaugh.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at Stambaugh. It's at the bottom, towards the bottom of 17, but it's also got the 18. You know what I mean? I can tell you it's Heidegger 17 as well, towards the bottom, right? For this to become clear, we need an original explication of time as the horizon of the understanding of being, in terms of the temporality as the being of Dasein, which understands being.
Yeah, time must be brought to light and genuinely grasped as the horizon of every understanding and interpretation of being. Yeah. Yeah, so that's probably the main place where I was.
Right. When he brings in temporality, so far that's the heaviest uses of horizon.
Yeah.
And I put it in the chat, but I can't help but think he got that from Nietzsche. But I don't know. You know what I mean? If anybody is like a Heidegger scholar and knows that he might maybe got horizon from an earlier source or a different source.
Did Husserl use that word?
Yes, Husserl used the word horizon. He talks about horizons. I mean, I thought Kant did as well, or Kant,
He maybe
I
did.
say.
I just off the top, I just can't pull it to mind.
Oh God, I didn't want to start that.
Oh God, we've got the first joke already.
This will be brought up in your, emergency revolutionary tribunal when you're in front of the tribunal. This will be brought up. I'll be there as a witness. Just letting you know. I can't help myself in that, and that's why I will also hang with you.
As long as we can go to the Black Forest first.
And draw water from the pump.
The opening.
And then walk into a clearing.
On that note, I was telling Enrique the other day, one of my first years teaching high school was actually my second year. It was actually my second year teaching high school. I had a student towards the beginning of the year. I was kind of spitting some fire. And this student's like, oh, you're one of my favorite teachers, man. I love you. But if I ever became dictator of the world, you'd be one of the first people I'd line up against the wall to be shot. And I just took that as the biggest compliment. You know what I mean? Because he was picking up what I was putting down. Total anti-establishment line. It's one of the best compliments, right? You would be one of the first one that I would put up against the wall to be shot. I got that from he was 16 years old.
Isn't that like a Kropotkin thing too? Something about future generations condemning me. Is that a Kropotkin thing as well? There's a famous clip from Kropotkin, I think, where he says something similar.
I don't know, but that sounds like it.
Something about like the babies of the future eating me. You know what I mean? For being anti-revolutionary.
If you're doing it right.
If anybody's curious, the German word for horizon that translates horizon is horizon with a T at the end.
Yeah, horizon.
Yeah. That's one of the good things about German is it's English is a Germanic language, at least mostly. The vocabulary is very Latin based.
It's a kind
I think horizons become relevant as we get as we get into the concept of circumspection. They become particularly relevant, don't you think, Chase?
Yeah, definitely. I just realized I think actually horizon isn't that from Latin? Jesus. Okay, don't listen to anything I'm saying. Yeah.
There's a lot of words in German that come from Latin.
Yeah, I think horizon is one of them.
Where English differentiates from German because of Latin roots, that's class. You know that.
Right? Yeah. Well, from the Norman conquest and whatnot. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think we've talked about that, right? Like,
I think so. Yeah.
The animal out there in the field when you have to like tend to it, what's it called? You know, and then the animal when it's on your plate and you're eating it, what's it called? You know, one is Anglo-Saxon and one is Norman.
Yeah. So I think actually I can make this relevant to Heidegger, at least more relevant. So a lot of what Heidegger does with language, so the traditional language of philosophy is very much based off of Latin. I mean, Greek, and then really Latin translations of Greek, scholastics, Descartes, and then I'm not gonna throw my boy Spinoza in there, but maybe Leibniz too, or somebody, you know. Anyways, it's Latin. And what is Heidegger doing with these neologisms and whatnot? He's taking kind of like regular German terms and trying to give them, raise them to a philosophical level. So I think it's pretty relevant in that, yeah, that specialized Latin vocabulary that kind of makes up the content of traditional philosophical language. That's what he's trying to subvert in a lot of ways and replace it with this folky down home German. And yeah, I think it's I don't know. You don't even know what I think about it, but yeah.
Well, that's what I don't remember if it was the original translator, or Stambog or Schmidt, but one of them brought that up, that Heidegger will use commonplace German phrases and wants to give them a philosophical import.
Mhm.
And I think part of that is I think there's two parts, at least two parts to that, right? There's him wanting to he's German. He wants to make German be like, important, right? But at the same time, I think he's trying to use that as a tool to unwind the work since Socrates, right?
Well, but that's, I guess, why, I mean, it's like, again, I love Heidegger, but I mean, that's where I was bringing in this Nazi stuff at the beginning, is it is hard to distinguish that fact, for instance, from the fact, like, it just dovetails perfectly with a kind of blood and soil, like, where the Volk type thing, not to then
But that's
say
not
it's
it.
not worth
That's
pursuing.
I don't think that's a particular. I mean, yes, that is a Nazi thing, but it's also just a German thing.
Yeah, I mean, that
think
goes
that
back
is
to
Yeah, but it's like
that
There's
goes
a-
back
not
to
just a German in the sense that he's like the chancellor of, like, you know, or whatever, you know,
at the
like
time he
he
writes
was
this
the
book, though.
rectorate of the
At the
Nazi
time he
Party,
at the
and I
time
do think
at the time he
well,
writes this book, though, he's not
Right.
a Nazi
right, but
yet,
he
right?
became
So
one because he's not challenging. At least we could say this, that his work wasn't in any way at odds with that. You know, that's not, I mean, and we all know that he was a Nazi, like deeply
Sure.
felt sentiments. That's not me saying this isn't to then discredit like the value of it and everything. It's like I do think that's an interesting source of a discussion, is how that dovetails with the Nazi project and his own private. It'd be
I
one
just
thing if he just was not a Nazi and then he just happened to like fall in
No,
line.
but it's
It's
just
like,
that it's what Deidre said. The Volk, those are the Brothers Grimm Nazis, proto Nazis. I mean, they wanted to
yeah,
collect
but he
all
was
the.
like,
But
yeah, I mean, I would just say the difference
if you're
between the
talking
brothers
about a
Grimm and
concept like
him.
Volk, you could
Yeah.
say why Nazism had a certain attraction to the Germans because of the pre-existing broad cultural acceptance of Volkishness, of
Yeah.
the truth of rural life. I mean, the Brothers Grimm literally were running around collecting these oral stories
Yeah.
because they thought that that was more connected to Germanness.
Yeah,
than
but they
what was
didn't
going
like
on in this.
they didn't live in the time of Hitler and then like fully endorse every element of
No,
what
I
he
know
said.
that, but by pointing out, this sense of Volk and that kind of, yeah, Hitler said Ein Reich, Ein Volk, Ein Führer, but the term Volk was already deeply embedded in German culture, and
And
so
I think it's really difficult to. I mean, I'm not gonna be an apologist for Heidegger, but at the same time, he didn't. He's not nobody. I don't know of anyone who has criticized him in any meaningful way for fully endorsing the ideology of the Nazis. It's that he never rejected it, and that he
Yeah,
took
but
advantage
with the black books
took
and all
advantage
that.
of it, and he saw where it fit with his
I
philosophy.
thought that other people might know more. I thought that was, and that, genuinely, like, this is naive, maybe I'm wrong. I thought that was like that. I thought that was discredited by the publication of the black books and all that. That he was like fully
No, well,
on board. And
in his private diaries, he said some pretty bad things, right? But what I mean is, contemporaneously, he was writing. This book was written for a German it was written in Germany at a particular time, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But it's not written as like a Nazi textbook. He's not writing this as a.
Of course not. And
Yeah.
I mean, to be clear, when I even bring this up, I'm saying it like in the spirit of Heidegger, you would think to take into account the historical moment of his era and his place in that moment would be significant to understanding him, and that's not to endorse, the project, but to take it seriously as at least, I mean, we could at least say like there are lots of people nowadays, not, there are at least some people who would maybe have Nazi sentiments that would like Heidegger. That's not to then dismiss. There's tons of people who don't, I'm not trying to overly simplify it, but that's a live interpretation of his work.
I don't believe in the black book in his black book. So he in his diaries that he ever comments particularly on the Holocaust. I think one of the big concerns with Heidegger is that he never comments on the Holocaust, and even though he had a Jewish mistress, right? So he disavowed several Jewish friends. He snubbed several Jewish friends. And he took advantage of his popularity of his work, the way it fit in with Nazism. But what I think is that the whole idea of the Holzweg and this rustic German feel about his work, something that was very important to him, is very important to a lot of Germans and was very important to the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
The Nazis, if you go and you look at Nazis were big into Gothic and even pre-Roman. Hitler sometimes thought of himself as a Teutonic Knight and all these weird things, right? I mean, there's all kinds of romanticizing of that was going on at that time, and Heidegger's work fit in with that, and he saw that it fit in with it, and I think he's like, oh yeah, they're on the right track. Then when they went off the rails, he never said, hey, you're going off the rails, guys, nor did he even later, after the war, when it was safe to do so, say, yeah, that was bad. So I think that's where his criticism is, but I don't think we can read him as writing as a Nazi. I mean, because what that does, it implies that the problem with that, I think, is that that implies that in 1927, in the writing of this work, he's somehow poisoned by a desire to exterminate the Jews, right?
No,
and that's
not necessarily.
That's part of Nazism.
Let me say this one thought, and then I'll shut up about it. I guess the question that arises is, and to me, it's a genuine question, is like, does he see the Nazi project as an ontic, expression of something which could lead towards something more ontological in the political realm? And if so, maybe he was just wrong about that, or maybe he was, what does that mean? Like, how do we grapple with that? Or am I misreading that? I guess I'm just skeptical of, not that you're necessarily doing this, but like attempts to say there's no intermingling of his politics and his philosophy at all. We should, it's just, I'm not offering that there's nothing worthwhile in his philosophy. I think it's like extremely profound. I'm just saying that's something to wrestle with.
Sure. And there was a fast-moving world back then too. Like, I mean, Hitler only became a Nazi 4 years before this work was published, right? So Hitler wasn't even a Nazi in 1922. So.
Yeah,
but even as late as 1927, the Nazi party, the NSDAP, was a fringe group. It broke into mass German politics with the September 1930 election. So I honestly don't see Heidegger writing this thinking, yeah, I think the NSDAP is really going to go Nova. And if I write this book ahead of time, and then it's going to be around, and then maybe I'll get a cushy
I don't think that
rectorship.
would be
Yeah.
a straw man version of what I'm saying. I just think, I mean, I think there's documentation that he was fully like on board with.
I
the
know, but what
magic
does that have to do with this text that was published in
Well,
1927?
to the extent that they're coming out of the same cultural milieu, and so it's just,
I think most non-Jewish Germans who were in positions in which they were in positions in which he had things to benefit from this, and it was a world in which he was. I think a lot of non-Jewish Germans believed in this kind of Germany. That's why Hitler rose to power.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And the whole reason that denazification had to happen is that too many people were Nazis, right? If you were in positions of any sort of influence, any sort of authority, you had to be a member of the Nazi Party. It's like being a member of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union or something, or being a member of the Ba'athist Party in Iraq.
I just don't think that it was. I guess I'm just saying I don't.
Yeah, I think
I'm
he did
not
believe
convinced-
in it too, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not convinced that his own that the personal and the political could be so distinctly separated, and that there's, especially just given the nature of his philosophy being one of like deep enmeshment in the given moment of, even history and all of this, that it can so tidily be separated.
Yeah, but when this book was published, it's the high tide of Weimar. Okay, from post massive inflation, hyperinflation, to pre-depression. This is when Germany is able to sign a series of treaties with a number of countries. This is the full flowering of Weimar culture. So if you're going to be talking about the environment within which this book was published, it's Weimar Germany, not the Third Reich.
I don't think
there are.
I don't think Heidegger was a celebrant of Weimar culture, though. I think
no.
I'm not saying he was, but if someone's going to use the phrase "the environment within,"
Nazism wasn't really.
It was functioning when this book was published. It's not the Third Reich.
Of course, but he's a cultural. He was a what's the term? The conservative revolutionary. I mean, he was part of that milieu of people who informed. We can at least say Nazism was probably to some extent informed by Heidegger's work. That's not to.
I think he saw Nazis as. I think he did.
The NSDAP was formed. It was a tiny party that was formed before anybody knew Heidegger was. The Nazi Party's ideology was not informed by Heidegger.
But not by the cultural milieu, which
you keep on saying cultural milieu, and then it's like a shift.
Well, we're talking about a philosopher who is deeply sensitive and.
If you go to Germany today, though, if you go to
the Communist Party of Germany was the second largest party when the Nazi Party was number one.
Yeah, and he hated them.
Germany. You pick your German milieu. Okay, German Communist Party was the second largest party in Germany in 1932.
I think that Heidegger did, though, see the Nazis as somehow knowing how to be, kind of, in a way, right? And that they were bringing into existence some of these ideas, bringing into practice some of these concepts but that doesn't mean that in 1927, when he wrote the work, he had that he was favorable to basic Nazi ideas.
Yeah.
And I think some of those same ideas that he would say, that he might have said that the Nazis were supporting, are ideas that still exist in Germany today, in rural Bavaria and throughout rural Germany. You'll find these same ideas of the rustic German, and I mean, there's stuff that seems awfully Nazi there still, right? And
that's all I'm saying. I think your last point there, it's not to indict his whole work, but just to say I think he got drunk on that. I
do think it's significant that one of his biggest, one of the Derrida, a Sephardic Jew, was like completely adopted a lot of his ideas into his philosophy.
Levi
Derrida
Knoss is
Derrida
another
relies on
example, right?
Heidegger. Derrida relies on Heidegger to a very
Totally.
large degree in his
And Sartre, I mean, you could name it all. So me pointing this out isn't to discredit Heidegger. I guess I'm just vocalizing a suspicion towards, the claim that they have nothing, his political project and his kind of philosophy have literally nothing to do with each other.
I don't think that's a
They
claim.
were-
I don't think that's a claim. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to make that claim that they
I'm
have
not
nothing
saying
to
you
do with
are.
each
I'm just, I was speaking to, I've seen that
Yeah.
claim,
I
in
just
general,
think that-
so speaking to that.
I think that when we spend we spend too much time like we are right now, right? When we spend too much time, and I'm helping with that definitely. But when we spend too much time on this issue, if we spend no time on it, we're being disingenuous, right? But if
That's
we
what I'm
spend
saying.
But if we spend too much time on this, we ignore the value of this work that is not if we're always focused on how this was implemented in Nazism or how this
Yeah.
ties into Nazism, I don't think we do it. He's not a political philosopher.
I agree, I think, with that. So, I hope I didn't come off like I'm saying, therefore we shouldn't spend any time talking. I've hoped I've contributed to discussing him. I was just,
No,
I
I
think
think
it's
this is
also-
very valuable to do
Okay.
this. It's just, I think it's very, and he is a very problematic person in that way. I think
Yeah.
he's very problematic. But a lot of people want to dismiss him. A lot of people don't want to
and
talk.
I don't. So to be clear, I'm not in that camp. So I'll stop. I know I've been hogging the. a little bit.
Yeah, I think we should.
on-
I think we should
Yeah,
all
on
just
closing. I was just wondering if you wanted to close out.
let's all just agree that Heidegger was an asshole, and then just keep reading him.
Yeah, and also I want to say he had a pretty sick mustache. I'm just saying. I think
Okay,
we
you
need
know who
to-
had a great beard? Freud.
That's true, and I think we're good on closing. Are we good on closing?
Yeah,
I would. Okay,
Hey,
so
before you leave, don't leave whenever I need to talk to you for a second.
what?
I was just asking Jason to not log off. I want to talk to him for a second.
Oh,
Yeah, I was gonna ask you to do the same, Ed. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so are the rest of us done?
So, I was gonna say one more thing. Although maybe I shouldn't, but I just want to say that. Okay, Philip K. Dick, his characterization of Nazis in The Man in the High Castle seems very relevant here, but I'll leave that to other people to track down. Page 42, The Man in the High Castle. Yeah, if you're really interested. I can post on the Discord.
No, I've got the book. I just got it for Christmas. So.
Oh, really? It's
Yeah.
yeah, I love it. It's great.
Chase, did you see the TV series?
I saw the first few, and it didn't really grab my attention. I was about to try to say that in Heideggerian, and then just gave up.
You just have to throw in always already. That's all.
Yeah, I was always already saw that, and it was no.
Yeah, we were always already going to have this conversation. Okay,
Oh, God.
And I think we're going to have it in the future, unfortunately.
yeah,
Yeah.
probably so. Okay, well, we'll see you guys. So Ed and Jason, I think if I quit, I think it's gonna terminate the session. So I'm gonna stay on, but I'll mute. So if you guys want to have whatever conversation.
Okay, it won't. I don't think it'll take long.
Okay.
You may want to kill
Okay.
the recording.
Bye, everyone.
We'll see you guys. Oh, yeah, let me stop the recording.